this edition of the English Standard Version to you. Have a look at it. Have a look at the notes. Check it out. You'll find it of interest, and we commend it again as something that is very valuable for the study of God's Word. Now, would you open your Bible, please, at Psalm number 11. Psalm 11. And we've been seeing that the Psalms are a school of prayer, and that when we enroll, we find ourselves in the company of Jesus Christ. Remember that the mind of Jesus would have been saturated with the Psalms, and so whenever we read any of the Psalms, we're reading what would have been most familiar to him, and that is why we have called this series With Christ in the School of Prayer. And today our title is How to Pray When You Feel Like Giving Up. This is an experience that all of us go through in different circumstances of life, and you'll see why I've given it that title from the second line of the psalm, which is where we begin today, where David says, "How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to the mountain?" Now, straight away, you see someone is speaking into David's soul. He's hearing advice, and the advice that he hears comes in through his ear, and it goes straight to his heart. And notice what the advice is, verse 1. Flee like a bird to your mountain. So someone is saying to David, David, it's time to move on. Why? Well, two reasons. First, for behold, verse 2, the wicked bend the bow. They have fitted their arrow to the string, and they shoot in the dark at the upright of heart. What does that mean? This person who's giving David advice, probably a friend, is saying to him, now look, David, there's going to be trouble. The bow is already being bent, and the arrow is being aimed at you. You're the target. You better get out of here. And then a second reason is in verse 3. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? David, the game's over. There's nothing that you can do now. There is no point in you carrying on what you have been attempting. Nothing that you are doing or saying is going to make any difference. Now, that's the advice that David is receiving, and it comes in through his ear, and it goes straight to his heart, and he says, now, why are you saying this to my soul? Now, verse 3 is one of the most famous questions in all of the Bible, and let's focus in on it for a moment. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Now, it would be easy to read that as a sort of call to action. You know, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Well, the righteous can pray, the righteous can organize, the righteous can witness, and so forth and so on. And that is true. But it is not the point that is being made here in this psalm. The point here is that someone, a friend, is speaking into the soul of David, and they're giving simple advice. And this person is saying to David, David, you're a righteous man, but you are in great danger, and there's nothing you can do, so why not think about yourself and get out of here as quick as possible, flee like a bird to your mountain. Now, it's not hard when you read through a bit of the Old Testament story to imagine how this advice could have come to be given to David. Remember that before David, there was a king called Saul, and his reign was a complete, total, and utter disaster. To faithful people, the entire years of the reign of Saul must have seemed like a time when the whole foundations of life in Israel were being, as it were, torn up. And we sometimes feel the same thing today, which is one of the reasons that the psalm speaks to us so powerfully. There used to be what we called a Judeo-Christian consensus in this country. You know, there's a God in heaven, he gave 10 commandments, and in God we trust gets printed on the money, and so forth and so on. Now, that may have been pretty thin for many people, but at least it gave a basis for life, and it gave to Christians some kind of foundation for talking to people about God and talking to people about our need of Christ on account of our sin against him. But as you are very, very aware, that is very, very quickly moving. These foundations seem to be shifting, And in the mind of many, many people these days, God is, quote, whoever or whatever he, she, or it might be. And if the foundations are destroyed, we find ourselves asking, what can the righteous do? What can the righteous do? What can the church do to turn this round? It just seems that things are changing so fast. And that's the question here. And someone is saying to David, there's nothing more can be done. You're the target now. You might as well get out of here. That's the point that's being made at the beginning of this psalm. And so this is a psalm that by definition speaks to the times when we feel like giving up. The times when you feel that nothing you do is ever going to make any difference. The times when you feel that it's just become overwhelmingly hard and you become desperately, desperately discouraged. Now, last week, if you were here, you might recall that we looked at Psalm 10, and we identified from that psalm 5 marks of the wicked. Do you remember the wicked are proud, they are foul-mouthed, they are greedy, they are violent, and they are godless. And after one of the services, someone came up to me quite moved, and he said, these 5 things, he said, I work in a mechanic shop, and these 5 things, every one of them describes the guy who's new and is working right opposite me every day. And he said, it is so hard. And many of you will be feeling this kind of experience. It is increasingly difficult to live a righteous life in the workplace. And here you are, you've tried to maintain a testimony. And now it seems that other people are against you. Their arrows, as it were, are pointed towards you and in your direction. And sometimes you get discouraged. And you begin to say to yourself, in the words of Psalm 11, oh, now, what good is it me being here? Nothing I do seems to make any difference. Wouldn't it be better if I was a pastor or a missionary or something? It's just so hard here. It's not easy. What's the point in carrying on? When the very foundations on which the business in which I'm involved seem to have been plowed up, what can the righteous do? Now, this is a very real question, and it speaks right into the realities of our lives and of our culture today. Now, who is giving this advice to David? We're not told, but most likely these are the words of a friend. These would have been the words of someone who cared about David deeply, someone who wanted to be protective towards him. And the advice that is given to David here is entirely reasonable advice. You may remember, if you know the story of David, he got himself into some pretty dangerous situations, and more than once he had to run. He had been chosen to replace Saul as the king, but you know that Saul never accepted that all the days of his life and fought against it until his dying day. And Saul was a man who was given to fits of rage. There were some very uncontrolled aspects of his character. And the Bible tells us that on one occasion when he became disturbed, he picked up a spear, a javelin, and he threw it in the direction of David, trying to spear him to the wall. David dodged, and the javelin missed. And it would be very natural after an event like that for someone to say, David, Saul has it in for you. His arrows are pointed in your direction. You're a righteous man, David, but you're not safe in this palace. There's nothing more you can do here by hanging around. The best thing is to think about yourself and to flee to your mountain. Indeed, if you read in 1 Samuel in chapter 19, that is exactly what happened on one occasion. David was married, of all people, to Saul's daughter, a lady by the name of Michal. And after this incident in which the javelin was thrown in David's direction, Michal came to David that night. And in their home, she said, David, if you don't get out of here, my father Saul is going to kill you in the morning. And in fact, agents had been sent by Saul already to David's house and were guarding the house. And you can read this story yourselves, a marvelous story. Michal lets David down from the bedroom window and then puts a stuffed dummy in the bed so that when the agents come in, more time is created. Did you know this is in the Bible? It's a marvelous book, by the way. You should read the Bible. It's wonderful. And put a stuffed dummy in the bed. The agents come in, and that creates more time for him to escape. And you actually find these words in the Bible. David fled, and he escaped. So there are times when that's the right thing to do. Do you remember Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, when they persecute you in one town, what do? Flee to the next. There was a time when a crowd in the temple, John chapter 8, picked up stones to stone Jesus. Fascinating chapter. It begins with a woman in adultery who Jesus rescues because people are going to throw stones at her. It ends, the same chapter, with people picking up stones, and they're going to throw stones at him. But Jesus' time had not yet come, so in the Bible we read this, that he hid himself. You just say, well, I'm going to stand here until you stone me. He hid himself. And then he slipped away from the temple. So when we face situations of difficulty, and especially situations of danger, we always have a choice. And when you find yourself under pressure, perhaps in the workplace, you may find yourself with this question, it's the old, should I stay or should I go? And if someone's pointing a javelin at you and has agents at your front door, then there's a pretty good case to be made that that's a time to go, right? But then we all know that there are many, many more times when it is far too easy to give up. The pressure's on you, and you know that God is calling you to stand. And what you need is to find the strength to do it. How do I continue? How do I persevere? How am I to pray when I feel like giving up? And when you come to that place, Psalm 11 is for you. Now, notice how David responds in this circumstance to the well-meaning advice of friends who suggest to him that the best thing is to hightail it out of town and to flee to the mountain. He says, verse 1, and now we're at the beginning of the psalm, in the Lord I take refuge. That's how it begins. So, how can you say to me, flee like a bird to your mountain? How can you say to me, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? So David says, I'm going to take refuge in God. I hear your advice that I should just, think about myself and move on, but that's not the right thing for me to do. I'm going to take refuge in God. So once you understand the beginning of the psalm, the great question then is, how did David do that? How did he do it? Because I need to know, how can I do that? The times when I feel like the pressures are coming in, I feel like I want to give up. How can I take refuge in God and not simply succumb to the pressures that every one of us at some seasons of our lives know all too much about? Now, I want to suggest to you directly from this psalm, and you'll see it's very, very obvious right there in front of you in the Bible, 4 ways to pray when you feel like giving up. How to pray when you feel like giving up. 4 ways to pray when you feel like giving up. And you should try to practice these. In other words, when you know you're in this situation, as you're preparing to pray, think about these 4 headings. They'll give you a kind of grid, a sandbox, if you like, for framing your prayer in a way that will be helpful. Now, here's the first. Challenge the voice of fear and frustration. Challenge the voice of fear and frustration. You see how he's doing that in the first verse? How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to the mountain? So he's challenging the well-meaning advice that has come to him. And I'm saying to you, because this is the school of prayer, this 11th Psalm, that here is something that we need to do as part of our praying in the presence of God. The well-meaning advice that was given by David's friends obviously came out of fear and frustration. The wicked bend their bow, they've fitted the arrow, that's fear. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? That's frustration. And David challenges these voices, and he says, well, now, how can you say these things to my soul? I'm putting my refuge in God. Now, notice David is not addressing God directly in this psalm. He doesn't say, in you, O Lord, do I take refuge. He says, in the Lord I take refuge. So this is a didactic psalm. That is a psalm that teaches us a framework for prayer. And here is what we must learn. That there are times when you and I need to speak to ourselves in the presence of God. There are times when you and I need to speak to ourselves in the presence of God. And you find this many, many times in the Psalms. Psalm 103, bless the Lord, O my soul. That's David speaking to his own soul and all that is within me. Praise his holy name. Why are you disturbed, O my soul? Why are you disquieted within me? And here you have the same thing. How can you say to my soul? Martin Lloyd-Jones often used to say, and I've always found this so very helpful, that one of the big problems that we face in the Christian life is that we often spend way too much time listening to ourselves and too little time talking to ourselves. You see what he means by that? You just listen to all these voices of fear, and they churn away in your soul. And what David does when he's hearing these voices, whether they be external or internal, he's addressing them. He's taking himself in hand, and he is declaring himself to himself his own confidence and faith in God. And that's exactly what we need to do. There is no better place to do it than in the presence of God. This is a wonderful part of prayer, to challenge the voice of fear and frustration. Come into the presence of the Father where Jesus is beside you. Tell him what you're feeling. Tell him what you're hearing. Bring out your worst thoughts into the open, all the frustration and all of the fear. And then take yourself in hand and challenge the voice of fear and of frustration and of despair, and do it in the presence of God. This is part of the gift of prayer, and it's part of the healing of the soul that happens with Christ in the school of prayer, right there in the presence of God. It's wonderful. Lord, here's what I'm afraid of. Here's what I'm so frustrated about. And then as you lay it before the Lord, challenge the voice of fear and despair. By the way, Jesus knows all about this psalm, as he knows about all of the psalms. It's just very obvious, isn't it? As we think about this psalm in relation to our Lord, the bow is bent and the arrow is pointed at the one who is upright in heart. Well, there's no doubt about who that is. I mean, Christ is right there, isn't he? The one who is upright in heart, and the bow and the arrow were always against him right from the beginning of his ministry. But let's ask this question. Did Jesus ever have to challenge the well-meaning advice of friends who had his best interest in heart but were speaking in the wrong direction? Yes, he did. At least twice. One that's perhaps less well known. Luke chapter 13 and verse 31. Fascinating. Some Pharisees came to Jesus and they said, quote, "Get away from here because Herod wants to kill you." Isn't that interesting? So here are some Pharisees who are well disposed towards Jesus. They weren't all his enemies. These ones were well disposed. They knew that Herod had it in for Jesus, and they said, "Better get out of here, Jesus. We want to protect you. Fly to the mountain." It's exactly Psalm 11. And of course, Jesus says to them, "Go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons, I perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course." Don't you just love that? And I love the way Jesus says, "Go tell Herod that fox." He's not moving away at all. He's on his course to Jerusalem. He knows exactly what he's doing. And of course, that will take you to the other time that's much better known, when Jesus had to challenge the well-meaning advice of a friend. Matthew chapter 16. Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus begins to tell Peter and the other disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, that he must suffer many things, that he must be crucified, and that he will be raised on the third day. And Peter says, "Far be it from you, Lord, that shall never happen to you." And that's the advice of a friend. And remember what Jesus says to him? "Get behind me, Satan." Isn't that interesting that Jesus experienced the temptation of Satan in the well-meaning advice of a friend? And H.L. Ellison, great Bible scholar, says this very well. He says, "The love of your friends will often create your most subtle temptations." Remember that. There will be people who really care for you and want to be very protective of you, and they will advise you to the easiest path that may not be the path that God is calling you to walk. And the love of your friends will often create, Ellison says, your most subtle temptations. And people who care about you may come to you at some point and say, "Well, now what's the point in carrying on? This is taking a toll on you. Nothing good will come of it." And their words go into your soul. And David says, "Now wait a minute. In the Lord I take refuge. So how can you say to me, 'Flee like a bird to the mountain'? In the Lord I take refuge. So why is it that you're saying to me, 'If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?'" So here's the first way to pray when we feel like giving up. Challenge the voice of fear and of frustration. Second, recognize the hand of God in the testing. Recognize the hand of God in the testing. Notice it comes twice here, verse 5. The Lord tests the righteous. So David's identifying that there's a testing going on in this experience. And then verse 4, the eyelids of the Lord test the children of man. So it comes twice. Now remember this, when the foundations of life, the things that you depend on in this world, seem to be shaken, the hand of God is always in the shaking. The book of Hebrews, God says, "Once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens." And then he explains the purpose of shaking things up. God says, "When I shake created things, it is so that that which cannot be shaken will remain." And the hand of God is involved in every shaking experience of my life and of yours. Very important to recognize that. Derek Kidner has a wonderful comment. He says, "The collapse of what is built on sand may be distressing, but it may also be a beginning." Isn't that perceptive? Here's something that's built on sand, and it's shaken. And you say, "Oh, that's terrible. Look, all that wonderful thing that was built, but it was built on sand. And now it's collapsed." And he says, the shaking of what is built on sand may be distressing, but it can also be it might be the beginning of building better on the rock. Of course, this is what happened to Job, isn't it? Job was a righteous man. God had blessed him in so many ways. And then one day, it all happened in one day. There were multiple disasters. Everything that he, at a human level, where it was like a support structure of his life, it was all taken away in one day. Remember his wealth that was represented by flocks and herds. They were devastated by raiders. And then his home was destroyed by a mighty wind. And his children, worst of all, his children who were in the house, all of them lost their lives. And suddenly, all the good gifts on which in human life we naturally depend, they're all gone. Family, wealth, business, all gone. Home. And you remember how Job's wife comes to him after this and says, "Now, why don't you curse God and die?" You see what she's saying? Look, everything that we've lived for is gone. God obviously has it in for you. It must be that his arrow is pointed in your direction. There's absolutely nothing you can do. There's no point in continuing. Curse God and die. And Job heard the voice of fear, the voice of frustration, the voice of despair, and it must have gone right into his soul, don't you think, from his own wife? And then what did Job do? He took refuge in God. And this is what he says: God knows the way that I take, and when he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. And the testimony of this man's faith reverberated in hell, and it reverberated in heaven, and it is still bringing strength to believers around the world even today. Amazing. And Peter the Apostle takes up that theme, being tested like and coming forth like gold. He takes that up in the New Testament, and you remember he says, now Christian, understand this, there are going to be many trials that come into your life. And here's what it's like. It's like gold that's being refined in the fire. And when that happens, your faith is going to be proved genuine. And the result will be that there will be praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. So challenge the voice of fear and despair. Recognize the hand of God in the testing. Third, affirm the sovereignty of God in the hardest times. Here's something to do when you pray, especially when you feel like giving up. Notice how from verse 4 onwards, the whole focus of David's prayer is on the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. Just look at this with me. Verse 4, the Lord is in his holy temple. Verse 4, the Lord's throne is in heaven. Verse 4, his eyes see. Verse 5, the Lord tests the righteous. His soul hates the wicked. Let him rain down coals on the wicked. For the Lord, verse 7, is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. The upright shall see his face. So after hearing this discouraging advice, he just gets his mind and his heart on God. And that's the thing that sustains him when he feels like giving up. And you know, when the foundations are destroyed, and especially when we're alarmed looking at the country and the culture that we love, let's remember this, that the foundations of righteousness do not lie in the culture. They never did. The foundations of righteousness lie in who God is and in what God loves. The Lord is righteous. That's what he's saying. And the Lord loves righteousness. That's the foundation. And the Lord is sovereign, even in the hardest times. And here's the last thing. Challenge the voice of fear and frustration. Recognize the hand of God in the testing. Affirm the sovereignty of God in the hardest times. And here's the last. Anticipate the joy of the final outcome. Look at the last line of this psalm. You'll want to underline it and take it right into your soul. The Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. And here it is. The upright shall behold his face. Did you know that was in the Old Testament? Not only the judgment of the wicked, but the righteous shall behold his face. Hard to imagine a greater incentive for pursuing righteousness than this. Hard to imagine a greater encouragement for persevering in the difficult place where God has set you down than this. The righteous are going to see his face. How can you say to me, just run away from it like a bird flying to the mountain, David says. I'm not giving up. I'm taking refuge in God. God is on the throne. He may be testing my faith to the very limits, but I'm looking ahead and I'm trusting in the sovereign God, and the upright are going to see his face. There's a beautiful story